The Shepnaz Podcast begins now.
Welcome to the Shepnaz Podcast. I'm Joe and I'm your host today. And for today we have a special treat for you. We have a message from Pastor Nick Shaner, our Johnstown campus pastor. We've been doing our Ruth series for the past couple weeks, and we thought we'd give you a chance to listen to one of his messages from this series. So we'll begin now with Pastor Nick.
How are you, church? Good. Like I always mention on occasion, I guess, don't tell me good if you're not. Let's talk after. If things are not good, how are you doing? Don't lie to me, okay? Don't lie to yourself. But hey, I truly do hope you are good this morning, and it's a good place to be, isn't it? God's presence with God's people, and I'm excited to start this brand new series. Are you excited? All right. Yes. All right, well, maybe we'll get there by the end of this. But we're excited to be starting this new series where we're exploring the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth. And to be honest, I've not spent a lot of time in the book of Ruth. It's a very short book in the Bible, 4 chapters, but it's an important one. And just to kind of get things started for us, here as we set this series up, a couple things you need to know about the book of Ruth. It's uncertain who wrote it, when it was written, and why it was written. Sound good? It's uncertain. We're not really sure about who wrote it, why it was written, and for what or for when it was written. But in a general sense, I think the story that's found in the book of Ruth is a story that communicates spiritual truths, right? Communicates spiritual truths that are important for us. Do you believe that? Yes. Okay, so we can approach this book of Ruth with understanding that there is something God has for us, right? That God has for you. There's a truth that God is desiring to reveal to us today here in the book of Ruth. But first, a little bit of context to kind of set up this book, setting up the context, setting up kind of the world in which this book is found is important. So after the escape from Egypt and the people of Israel were journeying through the wilderness, these people were led into the promised land by who? Not Moses. Moses got them all the way, very close to the finish line, but he died before he could actually lead them into the promised land. Joshua was the one that led the people of Israel into the promised land, the land that God had promised to them, a land that was flowing with milk and honey, right? And once they got in there, they were supposed to drive out all the people that were there, including driving out their gods, their idolatrous worship. And so in the promised land, this was God's desire, that God would be their God and the people would be his people. That was God's desire. That was God's heart, that he would be their God and they would be his people. They were to be God's specifically. They were to be God's covenant-keeping people. Covenant-keeping people in the promised land where they would obey the law, they would serve God and serve only God. This was what the life that God had for them. Here we read in Joshua 24, verse 20, "For if you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, he will turn and bring disaster on you and make an end of you after he has been good to you." All right. So this was what God's desire was in the promised land. Joshua led them into the promised land and they began to work this out and to have God be their God and for the people to be God's people. And Joshua eventually, newsflash, Joshua ended up dying. Okay, and the generation that came up after Joshua died. And then came a generation who did not remember God. Specifically, they didn't remember the mighty things that God had done, where God did miraculous things by leading the people out of Egypt and through the wilderness and into the promised land. A generation came and forgot all that God had done. This is why I think, just a little side, it's important to tell testimonies and to tell the stories of God, where we get up and, if you're not familiar, before the worship time every week, at 10:15, we gather and we share praises and testimonies of God's goodness, of how we see God at work, so we don't forget that God is a God of mighty works and does mighty and powerful things. We tell the story. Well, I don't know. They forgot. This group of people forgot all the mighty things that God had done. And so here we read in Judges, the story continues to progress. Judges chapter 2, verse 16. Then the Lord raised up judges to rescue the Israelites from their attackers. Yet Israel did not listen to the judges, but prostituted themselves by worshiping other gods. How quickly they turned away from the path of their ancestors who had walked in obedience to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge over Israel, he was with that judge and rescued the people from their enemies throughout the judge's lifetime. For the Lord took pity on his people who were burdened by oppression and suffering. But when the judge died, the people returned to their corrupt ways, behaving worse than those who had lived before them. They went after other gods, serving and worshiping them, and they refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. Not good for the people of Israel, is it? This pattern where they're supposed to be God's people and worship only God, well, they get mixed up. The people that they were supposed to drive out and all their gods, they don't do so completely. So they're intermingling with the people and serving and worshiping these false gods, and this pattern takes place all throughout the book of Judges, where they serve and fall into idolatry, and they fall into suffering and bad things, and then God rescues them. And this downward spiral continues. We see here in the Judges chapter 2 where things just got worse and worse and worse. The people became more and more corrupt, more and more morally and spiritually bankrupt, right? These judges, however, were supposed to be people that led them out of this and to be different. They were supposed to be in charge and to lead the people. However, these judges, they weren't like the judges that come to our mind, right? What do you think of when you hear judge? You think of courtroom, right? A judge with a gown and gavel. It's not the kind of judges that were leading the people of Israel. The kind of judges that were leading this people were military and political leaders. They were supposed to lead back and fight against Israel's enemies and to drive them out. However, if you read through the book of Judges, you see that these judges, these leaders, were corrupt. They weren't faithful people. Judges chapter 21, verse 25. The book of Judges, like I said, this story continues all throughout that book of this downward spiral until we get to the very last verse of Judges, Judges chapter 21, verse 25. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, the very next book. In the days when the judges ruled in Israel. In the days when the judges ruled in Israel. This is the scene of the book of Ruth, where the judges were the ones in charge. There was no king in this world in which everyone was doing as they saw fit. This opening verse here in Ruth chapter 1, it sets the scene, what sets the rest of the story in motion. The story starts off here as we see, in the days when the judges ruled in Israel. This is similar to when we tell stories, we say what? Once upon a time. This is the equivalent, except not followed by like cool, happy castles and fairies and different things. I don't know. I'm just thinking of when I tell Larkin, once upon a time. In the days when the judges ruled Israel was much darker. It was very ominous because it wasn't a good time. This time when the judges ruled in Israel was a time of moral and spiritual bankruptness. It was a time of decay, and idolatry was very much everywhere. It was a very rough and violent time for the people of Israel. I'm serious. Go back and read through the book of Judges. It's pretty gruesome of what takes place. Everyone, as we saw in the end of Judges, everyone was doing as they pleased. And you can imagine that would get pretty dicey, right? Pretty gruesome. Where everyone was doing as they pleased. And it's in these days that the story of Ruth takes place. In the days when the judges ruled Israel, this story continues in Ruth chapter 1, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. And then when they reached Moab, they settled there. Then Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons. The 2 sons married Moabite women. One married a woman named Orpah, and the other a woman named Ruth. But about 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died. This left Naomi alone without her 2 sons or husband. So here in this story, the first part of the book of Ruth, we're introduced to this Israelite family, and here in the opening verses, I think we're specifically drawn, our attention goes to Naomi. What was happening in Naomi's world was specifically the emptiness and the brokenness that she was experiencing. Right? As we just read through these first 5 verses, we see the amount of brokenness and tragedy in Naomi's life. It was a dark time after all, right? When the judges ruled in Israel, it was made worse, if that wasn't bad enough, where everyone was doing what they wanted, it was made worse by a famine. Now it is believed that the famine was a result of Israel's disobedience, right? When God says, you will be my people, or I will be your God, and you will be my people, you are to serve and to worship no one else except for me. Well, what did they do? They served and worshiped other gods, and they got mixed up. And so part of that response was things like disasters and famines. And so it's believed that this was a result of their idolatrous worship, this famine. However, this family is fleeing from this famine. They sought refuge where? In Moab. Are you familiar with Moab? Maybe not. That's okay. If you're not super familiar with Moab, this was a problem for them fleeing the famine and going to Moab, because Moab was traditionally an enemy of Israel. Read through the book of Judges. Moab was an enemy of Israel. Not only that, but this land of Moab, there was idolatrous worship going on. This was a land where the god Chemosh was worshipped, not the one true God. This move of them fleeing from Israel, from Judah, from Bethlehem in Judah, this move of them, this family, was both shameful but also dangerous. I believe it was outside of God's will for his people, that God would be their God, this was God's will, and they would be his people in the land that God had given them. Not somewhere else, not going and doing their own thing, but where God had led them, right? He led them out of captivity for the promised land. And here they are fleeing from that. They're running from that, going to a place that was shameful and dangerous for them. This signal, this move to Moab, signaled a lack of trust in God, right? Where there was a famine going on, they said, we're going to remember, it was a time where everyone did as they saw fit. So we're going to do what we think is best and go out to this land of Moab. Once in Moab, we see the story continue. Naomi became a widow, where her husband, Elimelech, died. You might be thinking, well, that's not good. But at least she has 2 sons to take care of her, right? These 2 sons of Naomi, they married Moabite women. Again, a no-no for the people of Israel. They were not supposed to intermingle with other people. They were not supposed to marry Moabite women. They were supposed to be God's people. But here they marry 2 Moabite women. 10 years later, these 2 sons die. Now, as a childless widow in her old age in a foreign land, we find Naomi, where she was a vulnerable widow. Not having a husband or children, she was lacking in things like protection and provision, right? There was no man in the picture, and this was a very male-dominant, a dependent society, right? So here she is, a vulnerable woman. Her options were limited to begin with, and even of the available options, they weren't really options, right? Maybe Naomi could have gone back to her father. Well, Naomi being older, her father was probably dead. Maybe another option for Naomi, she could remarry, maybe she could remarry. Well, she was probably past the age of childbearing years, so that was probably not an option, because that was a big thing for people in this time, is to continue on and have children. And and so forth. Maybe her option was support herself. Well, she probably didn't have a trade or any skills that would support that. So this left Naomi empty. Naomi was alone, broken, hopeless. And I believe she was empty, we say empty, but yet she was filled with things like grief and loss. Okay? The story continues in Ruth Chapter 1, verse 6. Then Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had blessed his people in Judah by giving them good crops again. So Naomi and her daughters-in-law got ready to leave Moab and to return to her homeland. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she set out from the place where she had been living, and they took the road that would lead them back to Judah. But on the way, Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back to your mother's homes, and may the Lord reward you for your kindness to your husbands and to me. May the Lord bless you with the security of another marriage." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they all broke down and wept. "No," they said, "we want to go with you into your people." But Naomi replied, "Why should you go on with me? Can I still give birth to other sons who could grow up to be your husbands? No, my daughters, return to your parents' homes, for I am too old to marry again. And even if it were possible, and I were to get married tonight and bear sons, then what? Would you wait for them to grow up and refuse to marry someone else? No, of course not, my daughters. Things are far more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord himself has raised his fist against me." And again they wept together, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth clung tightly to Naomi. "Look," Naomi said to her, "your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. You should do the same." But Ruth replied, "Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us." When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said nothing more. So the 2 of them continued on in their journey. When they came to Bethlehem, the entire town was excited by their arrival. "Is it really Naomi?" the women asked. "Don't call me Naomi," she responded. "Instead, call me Mara, for the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer, and the Almighty has sent such tragedy on me?" So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by her daughter-in-law Ruth, the young Moabite woman. They arrived in Bethlehem in late spring at the beginning of the barley harvest. So upon hearing that the Lord had blessed the people in Judah with food, Naomi does what? I'm going to go back. I'm going to return where the Lord had me in the first place. I'm going to go back. And when she arrived, everyone was excited, right? It had been at least 10 years, right, since Naomi and her family left. And when she returns to Bethlehem, people are excited, right? They're saying, is this really Naomi? Could this really be Naomi?
Well, we weren't able to get all of his message in today, so check in tomorrow to hear the conclusion of his message from Ruth. In the meantime, you can go to shepnaz.org to check on everything that's going on at the church. Also, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. We'd really appreciate it if you do those likes and shares and subscribes, because that way we can help spread the word to others that haven't heard the message yet. For Pastor Nick, I'm Joe. Have a great day. This podcast is a production of the Shepherd Church of the Nazarene, Gahanna, Ohio. Email to podcast@shepnaz.org and let us know what you think.